Welcome to Palette Tips. I'm Kit Bell. And today I want to talk about setting up an organized palette. Whether I'm working in watercolor or acrylic or pretty much any other media, I want to have an organized palette where I know where the paints that I want are. So I'll set them up in a certain way, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I'll do that the same way on each of these different types of palettes. I want to be able to reach for the color and my hand knows where it is without having to hunt around. I've taught a few workshops where I've seen some pretty unorganized palettes, and often when I'll ask somebody, where's your burnt sienna or what color is that? They actually won't know, and they'll, and then of course we can't really do much color mixing at that point. So for watercolors, I use an Alvin Heritage palette. You can get these at Opus or you can get these online. This one has 18 wells. It has a removable section here for a separate painting area or a mixing area, and it closes up really nice and tight. So this is very, very handy to take with me to go somewhere, paint plein air, or to take it to a little class or something like that. If I'm painting in open acrylics or if I'm painting in oils, which I haven't done for a long time because of allergies, I'll use one of these Grey Matters paper palettes. So these, it's very easy to mix your paint on this, put it away when you're done in some type of an airtight container. If you have oils on this and you want to keep it in good shape, you can put it in the refrigerator. And when you're done and you've messed up a sheet, well, then you just tear the sheet off and throw it out. So that's quite a handy method of dealing with that. However, for acrylic, I want my acrylics to stay moist and usable over a longer period of time. If I were to put acrylics out on one of these disposable papers, by the end of my painting session that day, I would have to throw it out. And I hate throwing out that much paint. So I've invested in these Sta-Wet palette systems. Now the one that's available locally in Kelowna and off the internet, maybe it's North American, I don't know, is the Masterson Sta-Wet palette. And it comes in a variety of sizes. So I like the big one, which is 16 by 12, and it gives me lots of mixing area for working. And I also like to have one or two of these smaller palettes, the handy palette, available to me if I want to mix larger quantities of specific colors and blends. This I can keep going for at least a month, so I can keep my mixtures available to me until I'm finished my painting. So today I'm going to show you how to set up a Sta-Wet palette, and then I'm going to show you how I set out my colors and the logic behind that, and then I'll also show you some tips about maintaining a palette, whether it's a Sta-Wet or not. Okay, to set up the Sta-Wet palette, first of all, you soak the paper as per the instructions. So I soak the paper in hot water for 15 minutes. And then what I like to do, first of all, is I like to put down some Lysol wipes. If I put some Lysol wipes down underneath the sponge, this is going to prevent that funky Sta-Wet palette problem that you otherwise can get when things don't get aired out very often. What happens is they go kind of moldy. So this will make things last longer. It'll mean that you don't have to replace your sponge as often, and it'll just keep the whole thing smelling a little bit better. You can use whatever scent you like. I like one that has a very, very light scent. So the sponge itself, I've taken the sponge, I've rinsed it in the sink. I have squeezed out quite a lot of the water. As you can see, it's not dripping wet. Now this one's been used before. I find I can get usually about 3 months out of these, but I do rotate them. Where you're going to find the biggest problems with mold and possibly the sponge kind of deteriorating, is going to be where you lay out your paint. So if I laid my paint out here last time, I would switch the sponge around so I lay it out in a different spot of the sponge the next time. And that just helps keep it going a little bit longer. And then I put the paper, which again has been soaked, but is not dripping wet by any stretch of the imagination. And if it's got a little excess water on it, I'll just quickly wipe that off with a towel, because I don't like that to put paint right onto that. So there we go, brand new fresh Sta-Wet palette, ready for painting. So when I lay out my palette, the way I like to organize it is I like to organize it basically from light towards dark, and I like to set up yellows through to the orangey reds, to the purples, through the blues. I have a convenience green on my palette most of the time, and then I also keep darks over on this side. So I'll talk about each of these as I go around. Now, as I am setting up the palette, I'm thinking about what is it that I'm going to paint. So if I'm going to be doing a certain type of work, I may be looking at a more limited palette, or I may be looking at a palette with a higher portion of transparent colors versus a palette that has a higher portion of opaque colors. Sometimes I will start with transparent colors, which I like to layer and glaze, and then I may move to some more opaques for the highlights and accents. So right now I'm using transparent colors for this painting that I'm doing. So I'm using, believe it or not, that looks like, I know that looks like baby poop yellow, but that is actually a very cool, beautiful yellow called nickel azo yellow. I also put out a warm yellow, so I have a cool yellow and a warm yellow. The main red/orange that I use is transparent red iron oxide. This is Winsor Newton. Winsor Newton likes to label this as burnt sienna, but it's actually PR 101, which is in fact transparent red iron oxide. Always have to look in and dig about these colors a little bit. What's on the label isn't always what's inside, or well, it is what's inside. You just have to read the label. So for this particular fall scene, a nice cool red will also work out well. There's a variety of cool reds that I could be using. And then I always like dioxazine purple. Dioxazine purple is a great modifier. It helps take out some of the chroma on some of the colors that are a bit too bright, and it's a great way to mix some darks. Now this is going to be a landscape painting, so I'm going to go fairly heavy on the blues here. That's a cobalt blue, which is a cooler blue. This is ultramarine blue, which is a bit of a warmer blue. Some of these lids get a little bit hard to open and close over time. This is anthracnone blue, which is again a really nice dark blue, so for mixing darks. And it's quite surprising in mixtures. For example, if you took anthracnone blue and red iron oxide, transparent red iron oxide, you would probably think you should get some sort of a purplish, but apparently not. You get a very muted green. So always good to know what your mixtures will do. My convenience green that I use in a lot of landscape paintings is Winsor & Newton's Permanent Sap Green. It's a lovely color. There are some other colors. If you can't get Winsor & Newton, there are others that will do the same job, but they may not be called the same. Golden has a very nice color called green gold that is useful. That's burnt umber, which is one of my darks that I move from light around to dark. And Golden's Payne's Gray is a nice indigo, dark indigo color. And again, I like it for its properties for when I want real darks in my paintings. So that's it. Now, like I say, in many other palettes for other purposes, I might have used some cadmiums or some oranges or some more opaque colors in there. But for this next painting, this will be a good palette setup. And I know where all the paint is, the yellows, the blues. I know exactly what order they're in so that there'll be no mix-ups as I'm going forward. So once you've been painting for a while, you're going to have a fairly messy palette. This one's actually not too bad, although this particular paper is close to the end of its life. But you want to save the paint. In some case, you're even going to want to save some of the paint mixtures. So at this point, a good old-fashioned palette knife and some paper towels and a bit of a dollar store spritzer will get this palette back to being ready to use for the next session or just to keep on painting for today. So the first thing I like to do is just take the palette knife and give all the paint that's mucky a good scrape off. So this is the same thing you do with a oil palette or anything else when you're finished with that particular set of mixtures on the palette. Then I'll give it a good spritz on the areas that I scraped. And then just wipe it off. I actually quite like the color that comes out of this. It's almost like working on the gray palettes that they have with the disposable papers. Now I don't want new mixtures to come up dirty, so I'll just give it a second spritz. The other benefit that this has is it also means that your paper is going to stay a bit more hydrated than if you just left it. Now, once the paper dries out, it's toast. So to get more life out of your paper, I can usually get about a month out of a piece of paper. Yeah, I have to watch the hydration level of the sponge underneath. So if I start to see the paper drying around the edges, particularly in the corners, this is telling me that the sponge underneath the paper is probably not wet enough. So it needs to be damp, but definitely not soaking. But what I'll do if I start to see things dry out too much is I'll just take some water. Now, I've got this water right here in a little used mustard container because it's just handy to have at the side of my workspace. And I'll just take it and I'll dribble a few drops of water in each of the corners. And that'll be enough to keep, whoops, a little bit over the edge. That'll be enough to keep this palette going for another little bit of time. The sponge stays damp, which means that the paper stays damp, which means that the paint stays damp. And that's pretty much all you got to do to keep a Sta-Wet palette going. I've kept these things going for a month at a time. Sooner or later, you will end up with tears in your paper or a bit of mold or whatever, but that's just life. Once you're done a painting and you want to put out some fresh paint, it's a great time to just get rid of the paper. The sponges themselves, as long as the sponge has not developed any holes in it, I'll just rinse the sponge out thoroughly, put it back in the Sta-Wet palette with fresh Lysol wipes underneath and a freshly, newly soaked piece of paper on top, and then I'll squeeze out more paint and away I go.